So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar today. So just as a quick introduction, my name is Colin Bailey, and I'm a PhD student at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, on shared Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories. And it may seem odd at first for me to be introducing this webinar and being part of this team as someone who's based in Ontario. But as we know, those borders are colonial borders, and living in Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories and working with the KSTPP since 2014 and Kahnawake particularly, we know that we're really working around understanding the territories from an Indigenous point of view before that Ontario-Quebec border was set. And so today we're going to be talking about best practices, resources, and positions that are involved in ethics, both at the institution and in the community. And a big part of this conversation is because we've had such a history of unethical conduct in the ethical space of research. And as a person who sat on the General Research Ethics Board at my institution for 3 years, I saw lots of research come through that was inappropriate, even in today's context. And that's why it's so important that we're aware of those resources and best practices that we can use to do research in a good way, specifically from the community lens. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. So before we get there, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to all of our speakers and talk a little bit about what they're going to be talking about today. And so our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Trina Delormier, who's an associate professor at the School of Human Nutrition at McGill University. And Trina is going to be introducing the newly updated KSTPP Code of Research Ethics, which is really an amazing resource that talks about the different ways that both the community and an institution can do research in an ethical way. And from there, I'm going to be introducing a community reviewer checklist, which is part of the KSTPP Code of Research Ethics. And it's really about broadening the role for the community reviewer as part of that process. Next, we're going to have Edith Belanger, and Edith is a PhD candidate at UQAT, and we really wanted someone from UQAT in particular to join us because when we did our environmental scan, looking at the institutional practices across Quebec and in parts of Ontario, one thing that we noted was that in UQAT, there was 2 spots that are designated as part of the Research Ethics Board that's dedicated to Indigenous committee members. And we really wanted to talk to Edith about her experience of going through that process as a student. And we also wanted to bring Edith here because Edith is working on an Indigenous-led research network as part of the Institute ERRSA-Qc-NEIHR as well. And our final speaker for today will be Tara Erb, and Tara is the network coordinator at the BC NEIHR. And they just conducted an environmental scan of the ethics processes at institutions in British Columbia. And we, as a NEIHR here in Quebec, are working on a similar project, looking at institutional practices in our area. And this is one way that we can share resources with one another. And we're very excited for Tara to join us here today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Trina, who can start us off.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Are we seeing the full screen of the presentation slides?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Colin?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So, and can somebody just remind me of how much time that I have so I stick to the plan?
15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So, welcome everyone. My name is Trina Delormier, and I've been involved with the KSTPP Kahnawake School's Diabetes Prevention Program since it began in 1994. And I'm going to be talking about the update of our Code of Research Ethics from the perspective of this being community self-determination in research. This is actually part of a presentation that I'll be making with Kalia Marqui, who's a community advisory board member for our project, and Sonia Peria Amede, who is a research assistant who helped with facilitating this process and has implemented research in partnership with Indigenous communities. But I'm just going to be presenting the part to overview our code today. So before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge our gratitude to all of the reviewers of the process to update the Code of Research Ethics. This process took over 2 years to complete and involved a lot of discussions. I'm not going to talk so much about those. We can get into them a little bit later, but focus really on the code itself and KSDPP as a program itself to provide some context to the talks today. So we have many academic researchers, community-based researchers, allied researchers, and allied trainees who were part of this process. And it was, like I mentioned, Anne Macaulay, who's founder of the project since 1994, and Sonia Peria Amede, who and I worked together to ensure that the momentum of this process was maintained and that it was completed. It was quite a lot of work to do this because, as you know, everyone is quite busy. And we didn't really set this as a project, but realized we had to, it was a time to do the update. So just to start by way of introduction, the Kahnawake Schools Diabetes Prevention Program began in 1994 and continues to today. And it initially began with the focus on the primary prevention of type 2 diabetes in Kahnawake. Kahnawake is a Kanien'kehá:ka, or sometimes we're referred to as Mohawk, community in Quebec near Montreal. And in the mid to late 1980s, there was research done by Anne Macaulay and another physician from Kahnawake on establishing the prevalence rates of type 2 diabetes. And from their chart review at the hospital on the reserve, they determined that this was 3 to 5 times the prevalence rate in Canada. So at this time in the 80s, there really wasn't much research happening on looking at prevalence of diabetes, of type 2 diabetes in Indigenous communities. And this result prompted the community to say, well, we're not going to study complications, which is what the next recommended study was, but we want to prevent this for future generations. And so that started this started KSDPP. What KSDPP was a program implemented in the schools, primarily focused on children in the schools, elementary schools, and it consisted of ecological interventions that focused on healthy eating, promoting physical activity, and doing this all in a very positive, strengths-based approach. And we're talking about ecological interventions. It's the recognition that there are many influences on eating behaviors and physical activity behaviors, and that we need to intervene at multiple levels. If we can see the spaces we live in as the school-based level, which was where there was a curriculum and monthly activities with classrooms, but also activities in the schools themselves. These were also family focused, so looking at the family level of influence and how can families support what children were learning in schools, and also community engaged. So how can we engage spaces in the community so that families can be supported to carry out healthy eating and physical activity? The research component of this was meant to evaluate what was the impact of these interventions, and also to evaluate the process of implementing these. So to be able to share, where were our strengths, where was it difficult to do this? And through all of this, it was designed, it was set up in terms of governance of decision-making in research as a partnership between the community of Kahnawake and academic researchers. So because this was a research project with a lot of proposed measurements, as you can imagine, and implementation of activities with children and collecting data from children and families, quickly it became clear that there needed to be a better understanding of the expectations on the community-based researchers and the expectations on the academic researchers. So, of course, any relationship requires a good communication and understanding of different expectations. So the Code of Research Ethics was developed as a result of an 8-month process of discussion to learn about those expectations, but also the obligations that researchers and community-based researchers have. So, the code contains principles for doing this research. And it also talks about the rights that the community has to determine and make decisions about research and how that research is used. It has guidelines for specific KSDPP research projects. So other research is going on in the community, but for KSDPP research specifically, we have these guidelines. And this is recognized in our community as well by our health organizations and our government organization. Within the code, we have explicitly written that we respect community self-determination and data sovereignty. And that, there's a co-creation of the research process between the partners. We recognize that research must benefit the community. And then we also have outlined the need to respect the distinct roles of community researchers and academic researchers. And I'll give you an example of some of the discussions because I participated in those back in 1994 and 1995. And it became clear, researchers, and specifically around one issue, which was the right, or should the community have the right to veto a research publication in the situation where the community did not agree with the interpretation of findings. And this was before we had results from the findings, right? We were still implementing the project and collecting preliminary data. And so it was, in the case where the community could decide that a publication could not move forward because there was disagreement on the interpretation, the academic researchers said, well, then we're not really able to confidently do research within this kind of decision-making because academic researchers are evaluated in their institutions by how many publications that they create. When you get money from a research grant, you're expected to share that knowledge, not only with the community, but more widely, and other obligations of the institution. And at the time I was, just recently working on my own research, and I'm trained as a dietitian and had graduated from that program. And it was eye-opening for me to realize that, I felt like I knew research, but more like how to do research, not necessarily about what it works like when you're in an institution. Now I know because I'm an associate professor at McGill, and I understand the obligations also to the research ethics boards. And so we had those discussions to build an understanding between the partners on the different obligations. And then academic researchers heard from the community-based researchers that there were different obligations there. If something went wrong with the research, if, this is sensitive because it's taking measurements of children's bodies, for evaluation, if something went wrong with that or any other aspect of the research, the community members have to face those families and their employers. So there was certain risks involved that academic researchers also needed to understand. So that 8-month process was really crucial and key for building an understanding. So taking time to understand each other's obligations and the process so that we could move forward in a respectful way. So that's what I wanted to share a bit about the process of coming up with the Code of Research Ethics. So just to let you know some of the key elements from the code, and I'll invite you all to download a copy. You can download it from KSDPP's website. It's www.ksdpp.org. But just to give you an overview of what is in there, and this is not everything, because as Colin mentioned, there's the checklist he's going to talk about, which is a new addition to the code. But we do have a section that addresses Indigenous methodologies and Haudenosaunee philosophy, so related to our confederacy, of which the Kanien'kehá:ka, our Mohawk, are one of 5 nations. We talk about obligations of community researchers and of academic researchers. We talk about the rights of the community and the participants in research. We've outlined and operationalized a review and approval process, which in a sense is like a checklist in that it outlines and describes key milestones in the research process where, for example, you need to present your proposal for the research to the research team. And when the research team, which represents the academic researcher partnership side, when they've looked at that for the scientific integrity and those sorts of aspects of a research proposal, then the community advisory board wants to see it, knowing that the researchers say, yes, we feel this is a feasible and rigorous study. The community will then look at the proposal in a specific meeting that they can determine that as a community perspective, that it's bringing benefit. They can suggest changes, have a discussion around, is this the best way to proceed for the community? And that's all outlined in this review and approval process, all the way from the initial idea to sharing the results of the research. We outline the consent process. Part of this includes community consent. We also have the section on data collection and data management, because we all know that after studies finish, there's still data that we need to steward and protect. There's a section that talks about dissemination, so sharing the results of research, publication, and knowledge translation. And finally, for this slide anyway, but not for the guide, we have outlined authorship guidelines so that we can include community members if they're interested in being authors, and other requirements for people who want to participate in publication as authors. And I have 2 minutes left. And the policy statement that's, has not changed since the initial Code of Research Ethics, in which I think highlights that these are still the solid values and principles that are still relevant today. These have not been updated, but it's that the self-determination of the Kanien'kehá:ka to make decisions about research is recognized and respected. The academic researchers, the other partner, obligation to contribute to knowledge creation in their disciplines is recognized and respected as well. So we have that balance. It is also a recognition that research should support the empowerment of Kahnawake to promote healthy lifestyles, wellness, self-esteem, and our responsibility for caring for 7 generations. And because I've been mentioning this revision, I thought it would be interesting just to share how the initial Code of Research Ethics was written and shared and copyrighted in 1995 after an 8-month process. And after KSDPP's initial research, which was supposed to be 3 years, I didn't mention that earlier, and because there was such a momentum and success of the project, it did continue supported by the community for 2 years. and continuing some research activities. And then, you know, we were in that time applied for other grants and were able to fund another research program. So in 2005 and 2007, with these new research projects and new, you know, that we're looking at different aspects of KSDPP, we did a revision in 2005 to 2007. And compared to the first one, which was primarily researcher driven in the sense that it was all the research team recognizing that we needed these guidelines, and compared to the revision in 2007, which was primarily community driven, where Community Advisory Board was going through the code and coming up with suggested revisions to reflect our expanded research program. So the final revision that we've just had, I mean, the most recent, I shouldn't say final because we have the next revision is not scheduled, because we do this, I guess, when we feel it's the time is right. So we just finished a second revision, which was also community driven in this year. So the revision allowed us to have a meaningful conversation, much like the first initial code allowed us, and much needed discussions about how to conduct research at KSDPP. And the process fostered shared understandings, which are essential for consensus decision-making. And the results of the revision is generally, we learned that the discussion fostered also understanding for newer researchers, trainees, and community members. So it's the process that really had a lot of the benefit to sharing this understanding of how we do research at KSDPP and how we could do it differently in the new context. So with that, I'll say Anyawa, merci, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Trina, for your presentation. And it provides a great step for me as well, because I will be continuing that conversation around the KSDPP Code of Research Ethics and one particular aspect of that. And I'll just ask for a thumbs up from someone to let me know that you can see my full screen with the slides on it. Perfect. So it's my pleasure today to introduce to you the Community Reviewer Checklist, which is one aspect of those new revisions from the KSDPP Code of Research Ethics. And one thing that I wanted to just mention at this point is that although my name is on this particular presentation because I'm talking to you in this webinar today, I want to acknowledge that this was not a one-person process. There were a number of people that were involved in creating this checklist, which I will talk about later on in the presentation. But particularly, I wanted to thank the Kahnawake Community Advisory Board for all of their hard work in terms of talking about their experiences of reviewing research projects from a community point of view, and also Dr. Morgan Phillips, who was instrumental in refining the checklist and going through the process of making sure that it was a practical tool that could be used by community reviewers. And so I'll just provide a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. The first thing I'm going to do is just provide a very brief definition or discussion of what is ethics. And I know for this call, most of you will be familiar with that, but I'm going to do it mainly because there are three components in this particular definition. And I really want to emphasize that not all of them are really comprehensively covered by institutional ethics processes. And that's why it's so important that we have a community role as part of the review process as well. I'll talk briefly about institutional ethics and specifically about my experience at Queen's, having sat on the Research Ethics Board for 3.5 years and having reviewed hundreds of applications in that time period. I'll also talk about the important role that community plays in terms of relational ethics, which is something that's oftentimes missing from that institutional process. That'll bring us to talking about the process of how we created the Community Reviewer Checklist, and I'll introduce you to that checklist. And then finally, I'll just leave you with a little bit of discussion around why this is something that you may be able to consider for your own project as well. And just for those of you too, when you see the word checklist, you may be potentially having a negative connotation with that, because the idea with a lot of checklists is that you check something and then it's something that it's done and you don't necessarily have to consider it anymore. And although we're using the word checklist, this is meant to be a living document of something that's really a guide or support for the community reviewer to really feel that they have the ability and confidence to talk about a research project to make sure that those obligations are being met by the institution, by the researchers that are involved in the project. So this definition specifically that I'm going to be talking about comes from Yoke and Bryden Miller, and I'm going to talk about it in two different components. So when we think about ethics, one way of thinking about it is that we really have core values that really are instrumental in the way that we conduct ourselves. And the way that we conduct ourselves are really related to our relations. Not only with other human beings, but also other creatures, the physical and spiritual realm. And those components are really an important aspect of ethics in a context that's largely not considered in the institutional research ethics process. What the institutional process really focuses on is those decisions, and that's basically the implications of the way that we conduct ourselves, of our relations, and how that influences our work with either our participants or co-researchers in a research project. And so the institutional process really focuses on those decisions. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we have a community review process as well. So just to provide an example of what a community's role could be in a project, and this comes specifically from our project, a community mobilization training project that we're doing as part of KSTPP. So if you had, for example, a student that was proposing a project that would be part of their thesis, the first step that would have is they would go through a supervisor review. So that's the person in the institution that was directly supervising that student. It would then go to a research team to look at and create a broad consensus of whether it's a project that fit well with the project, the overarching project. It would then go to a community review. So any communities that are involved in that project would have an opportunity to talk about whether they would like that project or it's a good fit for them in whole or in part. You'll see that the arrows are bidirectional. So these conversations move backwards and forwards. It's not just a linear process. And then finally, the last aspect is a project advisory circle, also with each having members from each community that are involved in it, overseeing the project over the entire term of that project's existence. While that process is going on, which is quite a thorough process of community review, the university is also doing their own separate review on that project as well. And so one question that gets raised from the institutional point of view, oftentimes when I would be involved in on board discussions and talking about the community review process that happens concurrently, is people would ask, why review what has already been reviewed? And a big reason for that is because there are serious limitations when it comes to understanding the way that institutions currently review projects from their point of view. One is that it's largely driven by something called the Tri-Council Policy Statement, which is really a set of external rules that are applied to research, which Research Ethics Board look at in terms of whether your project fits with that Tri-Council Policy Statement. There is a chapter that's dedicated to Indigenous peoples, and so that provides some understanding from an institutional perspective on what some of those challenges are in terms of unethical conduct that's happened historically and is currently ongoing, but it doesn't necessarily account for all those elements. And a big reason for that is because institutional ethics is largely driven by two different types of ethics. One is duty or deontological ethics, and the other is utilitarian ethics. And I won't go into a lot of detail about what those are, but just briefly, when you talk about duty ethics, oftentimes thinking about whether actions are right or wrong, and then understanding that we have a duty to actually follow through and act accordingly based on that. And so those rules are applied, and it's largely driven by an understanding that research is value neutral and that it's potentially objective. And so working in Indigenous context, we know that both of those from an Indigenous paradigm are false. So that's one of the things that we need to consider as a limitation of institutional ethics. The other thing too is that, and this is the language directly from the Queen's website in terms of the research ethics process, is that you can see the strength of the language here, that the principal of Queen's University has invested in the General Research Ethics Board the authority to review unilaterally determining whether a project is ethical or unethical. The other thing that I want to point out that's also highlighted on this slide is that it really focuses on, Tri-Council policy statement really focuses on research that involves humans in particular. And we know not all research projects involve humans. And so that's also an important consideration I'll come to later of why we need a community review process as well. The other thing that I mentioned too was utilitarian ethics. And so really very broadly speaking, and this is an oversimplification, but really creating the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people and lessening that harm, overarching harm. The challenge is that with a lot of research that's done in Indigenous communities, it's an emergent design. And so communities and researchers are moving back and forth talking about what those methods are and how that research is going to be done in the community. But we don't necessarily know what the benefits and harms are going to be a priori. And there are some forms and ways in the institutional ethics process to be able to deal with those emergent research design. And that is partially built into the Tri-Council policy statement, but it's still limited in its nature based on the way that we do reviews, because the idea is that you receive ethics clearance and then you go into your project, and that all happens before your research project begins. So that's why it's important that we have this relational ethics project. And that's really a recognition about this interdependence that we have on one another as researchers working with communities, and understanding that we have accountability as researchers to the communities that we're working with that also need to be considered as part of that process. And this is really what drives the initial discussion of why something like a community reviewer checklist could be something or a tool that's beneficial for the community in that process. The other thing that I alluded to earlier on in the discussion was about research involving humans. So I wanted to just provide an example. So if you're working on a project that just involves program improvement for the purposes of program improvement. So let's say you're taking an activity like Racers for Health in Ganawagi, and you're just looking to improve that program. It's not subject to institutional ethics review, nor is research that doesn't involve humans. So if you did like something like a systematic review looking at documents, those would also not be subject to institutional ethics review. And that's why the community review process is so important, because those projects still have implications for the community. But in the absence of any institutional review at all, that shows you how important that community review process is. And so how do we go about creating this checklist? The first thing that we did was contact everyone that was involved in the Ganawagi Community Advisory Board, and talk to them really in terms of stories about their experiences of being a reviewer. And we really tried to get an understanding of what that process was like, what kinds of tools and resources people thought might have been helpful in the early days when they were new to the review process, and what it was like to be sitting on a board, looking at research from a community lens in terms of meeting those obligations that they have to the community. So from there, we created an initial checklist, and then Dr. Phillips and I were involved in refining that checklist into a set of items that could be considered from the community point of view based on what those discussions were. And then we took that checklist and we hosted a webinar. So that happened about a year and a half ago, where we had a project advisory circle that was involved in a project through KSDPP that actually had an opportunity to take a real project that was ongoing and use the checklist and see if it was actually useful. Because the whole point of this exercise was to create something that was practical and would act as a real support for community reviewers as part of that process. And one thing that came up in our stories when we were talking to the Community Advisory Board over and over and over again was this idea of community members bringing up, why is the researcher doing this research? That was a big question that's raised, and something that from an institutional point of view is not always the most important consideration. And so you can see from this word map here, that a lot of the words that came up was making sure that research is meaningful, that it has specific intentions, that is bringing clear benefits to the community, that it's about building capacity, it's inclusive to all community members. And so you can see from the language here that it helps to show what that community lens might look like in terms of how a project is reviewed to see if it's being conducted in a good way, and how that might be different from the way it's understood from an institutional point of view. And so from there, a lot of the items that came out of that list were organized into the 4 R's of research framework, which you may be familiar with. So that's from Kirkness and Barnhart. But a number of researchers have looked at this, and some add a 5th R, which is relationships, which I like to put right in the middle because it really ties everything together. And this is really about respecting Indigenous ways of doing things, Indigenous methods, Indigenous ways of looking at a research project from an ethical point of view, making sure that it's relevant to community needs that are already in existence in the community, making sure that there's reciprocity between partners, that it's not just one way, that the researcher is the one benefiting from the project. And finally, being responsible through community participation. So not the idea that you're going to be doing a research project and the classic example, you get in on a helicopter, you do your research and you get out. No. This is the responsibility of the researcher to actually participate in that process and ensure that community members are also having an opportunity to participate in that research. And we can hold them to account through the checklist that we've created. Another thing, and this is included in the Tri-Council policy statement, is the OCAP principles. But with that being said, the way that OCAP principles are applied is really a priori before a project is even underway. And there's no follow-up from the institutional ethics review in the institutional ethics review process to ensure that OCAP principles are actually being applied in a project. And so I know many of you are familiar with that, but just broadly speaking, ownership is not just about the individual ownership of knowledge, but just the collective ownership of a nation's knowledge by that nation. Control is really about being able to determine who and in what ways a person can access that information. Access is really about making sure that the community, even if that information is physically in an institution, even temporarily, that community members maintain access to that information over time, and that there's a plan in place for community members to become data stewards of that information. And this oftentimes is, if we're not doing this in the community review process, we don't know how the OCAP principles are being applied from a project from start to finish. And that's something that isn't really being accounted for in that institutional process. So that brings us to the checklist, which has a number of different items broken down into that 4 R's framework that I talked about previously. And I'm just going to go through a couple of those items briefly. I will note as well that one thing that was discussed by the Project Advisory Circle when we were talking about using the list is making sure that there's room for communities to determine if there's specific items that are important to a community, that they're able to add these items. So this is not meant to be a static checklist. This is something that can be added to, and items that are not relevant to a community can be omitted for a project as well. So specifically for respect for Indigenous ways of knowing, so like I alluded to before, making sure that we're including Indigenous methodologies, knowledge, and experience in the project. And so making sure that we're right from the very beginning that projects are following and fitting within that Indigenous paradigm. In terms of that responsibility for community participation, a big part of that is making sure that that consultation process continues throughout. And it's gotten better over time in terms of, for some researchers, it's gotten better over time in terms of the level of participation that community members have been involved in research projects. But making sure that there's opportunities at every stage and that that's an ongoing discussion through a research project. In terms of the relevance of a project at the bottom there, so making sure that there are real benefits to the community involved in the project was a big one that came out, making sure that that contributes to community well-being. And at the top there for reciprocity between research partners, making sure that there's an opportunity for some capacity building that's involved in the research project was one of the things that the Community Advisory Board noted was something that was really important for making sure that a project was being conducted in a good way from the community's point of view. So that was very brief, and I'm happy to continue that discussion around the checklist afterwards as part of the questions, and also if you have any follow-up by email as well. But I also just wanted to put this in the context of all the different webinars the NEIHR's been putting on, and these are just some of the broad categories of what those webinars are. And just like Trina talked about in her presentation, a big reason why the checklist was developed was simply to to understand that from a research point of view, that this is about sovereignty and self-determination. And so in that research box that you see in that bottom right-hand corner, the community reviewer checklist is really about making sure that community research is self-determined by the community, and making sure that community members, especially those who are new to the review process, feel confident in their ability to be able to determine what research, by whom, and how is done in their community or with their community. And so I just wanted to finish off with just very quickly talking about where you can find the checklist. And part of this is also where you'll find the Code of Research Ethics, because it is embedded in that document. So if you go to KSTP website, you'll be able to see that there's a tab there for the KSTPP Code of Research Ethics. When you enter it, there's an opportunity to download that file, and that's the most up-to-date version of that Code of Research Ethics. And within that, Appendix H is the community reviewer checklist. So if you're looking for that document in particular, that's where you will find that. And with that, I'll finish, and I look forward to our discussion later on in this webinar. Okay, and now I will turn it over to Edith Belanger to talk to us about her experience at UCAT and the ERRSA-Qc-NEIHR Institute.
Oui, oui. Je vais partager mon écran.
Good morning. I will share my screen. Give me a sign to make sure that you see me properly in the screen. So fine. So today, I will be talking to you about research project and Indigenous context studies and the preoccupation and issues that I've met in my project. I will also present you to or add to other point, and I will talk to you about the different situation that has been put in place in the University of Quebec in Abitibi-Témiscamingue, precisely in the School of Indigenous Studies, ethics, and also other things. And I will also be talking to you about the roles and the research, Indigenous research, or the group that we're building right now at this university. Well, of course, the ethical consideration, of course, that I will be talking to you about during this presentation is emerging from my own personal experience. So I've started a few years ago a research project. It became a PhD project, and I'm studying right now the governance structures, traditional governance structures, and the law principles of the Wabanaki Confederacy. Wabanaki Confederation and Confederacy is present symbolically with this image that you see on the screen, and it is really well, what the symbol is explaining about it is the most part of it. It's composed of 4 principal nations, which are represented by the 4 spirals here, the Malicite, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Micmac, and Wolastoqey. So these are the first major. In order to be able to really bring about these structures and the legal subject that are attached to it, I need to develop a methodology that will allow me to be able to read behind the line, like under the line, in between the lines, because historically, the research historically had really had little effect on the or access to the necessary sources so we could understand properly these indigenous structures. So my methodological approach is really targeting to reconstitute what was a point of view from a point of view of Wolastoqey. Of course, it's not sufficient to be able to remake a real proper lecture. So I decided to join it with the language of Wolastoqey in order to be able to really be more concrete and precise. So will also follow the studies of 17th century research, which it has been extensively connected with a French man who studies at that time. So maybe working with the protocol of ceremony, the traditional oral traditional, these are not necessarily documentary sources that are common in the academic world. So I have a lot of questions to ask myself, and the nature, very personal nature of this research, because I'm a woman, I lost a woman, I studied the language, and I must ask myself many questions in relation to my relation with this research subject. In order to do this, to do this methodological approach and to develop my framework of references, I got really interested at the history of the research and the research in digital context. I was not the only one to do this, because since then, many work have been done by Mr. Martin, by the way, and it is explained in the book written by Ms. Wilson. It's titled Research and Ceremony in 2008, which really recalls a broader situation in research on Indigenous people at a time. Of course, we don't need to take it word per word. It's pretty fluent, but it still remains a model that is very interesting. The first phases that we call the first phases of research, we call terra nullus. We studied how colonization settlers on Aboriginal lands, Indigenous people barely have human status. So we have a very interesting philosophical approach, where we're asking, does the Indigenous people have a soul? Are they human? Because at that time they considered the Indigenous people as object. They barely have human status. So the other phase is what we call the research of salvage research, they call it, because we had a vision at that time. It's a traditionalization. It has an approach of folklore approach, and considered that, well, these people were over beyond and all, they were called to disappeared, and we were taking their measure, registering certain things of them to sort of keep some kind of a history of them or memory. But this kind of attitude remained quite a while. Then the vision that we had is assimilation is the vision. At that time, it was correspond to the Canada, where the government were using the Indian problem. That's what they were calling it. It's because regarding their culture, their governance, we're targeting to the project of Canadian project of the development of the colony and of the countries, of course. So they had to assimilate the Indigenous people. So they should become good Canadian. So at that time, there were all kind of public policy that had developed based on research work, and was led, of course, by non-Indigenous expert. There were studied what is the most efficient way to assimilate Indigenous people. So, and then afterwards, as the two world war on a worldwide reflection that we had on human rights, it was another exception of the rule. The Indigenous were not becoming an exception, so they become the most studied group, but always from an outside point of view. It was largely done by the non-Indigenous people, of course. And it was most following to the certain inquiries that we see the phase of the we call recent Aboriginal research phases, the commission and inquiries, structured issues, emergency research, indigenous perspective. We saw through different research there was some systemic problem which the indigenous people were confronted with. And this was to deploy some kind of a research movement, an emergency in research targeting to repair as quickly as possible all the harm that these inquiries have caused with the indigenous people. This is where we see the first perspective appear with the indigenous people regarding the research. So this refers to the book I talked to you before, Monsieur Martin, which is dated from 2008. Of course, there was a lot of water went behind the bridge under that, and the research continues to emerge. And we can ask ourselves today, where are we at in reference to the large, important questions? Of course, there are many. It's my experience, actually, in my point of view, what I see through these. Well, actually, there's some kind of a reflection that are not streamlined, but I could feel that there's a lot of attention brought on the challenges that represents the fact of being an indigenous people making research on indigenous subjects, which is close to it, their representation and close to their reality and their issues. So this brings a lot of questioning, and let's remind ourselves that in science we rule by this neutrality principle regarding to your subject of research, but here it is almost impossible in many of the research projects done by indigenous people to be sort of neutral. It's very difficult to have this neutrality. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. So there's a shift in the paradigm. So how do we make research in co-creation, in collaboration, a real collaboration? Are we able to go over and above comparison and the integration of knowledge, traditional knowledge, to the academic knowledge? Can we come out of this dualities, which is two realities regarding the knowledge, acquiring of knowledge? So it really goes through the research and action. So it also questions ourselves on the paradigm shifts which are necessary to reconciliate the indigenous research with science and the academic world. We have talked about neutrality earlier, of the neutrality of the researcher, but we're questioning ourselves also, what is the law? How could a natural law, how could the legal component or practices of indigenous, if they are considered as law, how could we work with that? Because what is the truth? What is the proof? What is the fact? How could we juggle with all these questions when we're talking about oral tradition, where tradition becomes laws because a source of knowledge, but it's very appreciable, but it is changing in time because it's related to reality. So we see this all through the academic reality when we're dealing with the indigenous studies, but we deal with this in the Canadian reality context here. And it shows really there's a large gap between the indigenous research in the anglophone world and in the francophone world. I could see a conference lately that was saying that 10 indigenous researchers in Quebec, francophone, and that does not mean that within those 10 researchers, they all work on indigenous subject necessarily. It's not an obligation. They're not forced to do this. So there really is a very large disparity and differences between indigenous people and indigenous research. So the question looks a bit funny. It says, do I need a certificate to interview my dad or my father? Well, it's a question that I had to ask myself at one point. I had to be confronted with it because myself, I was a result of a traditional adoption. So I need this knowledge. I need his indigenous knowledge, his vision, because I'm working in the traditional governance. So how I can combine and conjugate with this? How could I find myself to practice and keep maintain an ethic and not bring up a judgment on that? So I'm talking to you about this because the different authorization process were also associated with the administrative decision. They were really strict and really we want them to be normative, but what are these processes anyways? but these processes are not allowing us to integrate our specific question, which are very important for the researcher and also the community. So we have to be well aware of how will I do, what will I do, how could I consider the trauma that is associated to that, because how to addressing the trauma and the trust issues, because this is what as soon as I start talking about my research project, I really had almost like a complete refusal, a wall of refusal. How can we behave? How could I deal with this? So this is very difficult, especially when we start with good intention. And for most of us, I think that we do that. We also have to compose with the reality of the smaller communities, where the information is really circulated at the speed of light, whether they're right or wrong, false or true. Sometimes the research project could be misinterpreted and it really make a big snowball. It really could take an incredible dimension. I talked to this about it earlier. So how could we, how do we position ourselves clearly to be honest, and how could we remain conscious of this position? Or asking ourselves, is a neutral positioning is good, or is a personal position and is the best? Will it evolve through the time? How to deal with this reality of positioning yourself? Is it myth or neutrality? But at the same time, we must make sure that this knowledge become visible and accessible for the academic level. So we really sort of swim in a very vague environment. So in order to confront this cultural biases or these different aspects or point of view, it always comes to sort of taint and modify or shade the way we're working. So it's really peripheral of all the question that that we need to review ourselves of what is the ethical questioning here, and if there should be one question only that we should ask ourselves at one point in our life, not only asked at the beginning of project, but all along the project, why am I doing this actually? And there are very many different elements that could be used in order to allow ourselves personally challenge ourselves when we're trying to respond to this questioning. Why are we doing this kind of research? We can ask ourselves, how, in which way are we integrating these principle of the PCAP, or what are we, where is the importance that we put personally on these things, and how have we adapted or dealt with it? So because these OCAP principles are very important and have very meaningful return. It's not a question of a personal involvement or not, whether we had one or not. At the beginning, we developed connection and relationship in the research. We can ask ourselves as well the fact that being involved in this research, does it give us a better legitimacy, a liability and legitimacy of a researcher regarding the people to whom we talk to? Have we had access to secret or sacred information like the ceremonies and or access to certain elders? Who has to, how and who has to convey this information? I have to ask myself honestly, why is this research important for me? But it is also important for the research because most of the time we address ourselves to the Ben Council because they are a legitimate authority, but there's many other people that could be involved and interested in these research information. Then afterwards, am I really invested of a mission myself, or am I putting my on my shoulder a political weight, or it happens. This is an additional political charge that I put on myself. Do we have a responsibility? Do we have a kinship responsibility because we have developed a very close relationship with those people, or did we have those connections earlier? So this could help really through all our research to respond to the question, what is my implication? Why am I doing it? It's not necessarily a guarantee, but it allows us to sort of have a walls of limits to make sure that we remain in a process that is that remains very ethical. I know we're going very quickly here because there's a lot of important inspiring work here. I did some collaborative research on the field as well, and this is a very, very concrete project, but behind methodology, there are all these questioning being asked. So inspiring works and reflection, I do contemplate on that, and we have a couple of names here and references that we could use. I have the opportunity to have the my doctorate studies in the ECAT School of Indigenous Studies. I feel very comfortable to discuss with the people around me, the staff, and also the other people, the other researchers, because they have developed a unique approach and a very innovative approach by inputting infrastructures like First People Pavilion and the Housing Facility for Families and other initiatives. There's a lot of resources that help families, Indigenous families and students to set themselves up and organize themselves in order they could pursue their studies. As far as the ECAT, I put a community and they put some kind of a committee of references, and they put together the Indigenous, but they built a committee, but the committee cannot have students in their committee, but it's really the ethical committees that is designed and have a seat for people that have a vision and are really roots and anchoring strongly in the community involvement. And there's also at the community level and the university itself, they're trying to project this community involvement, and they really try to implement this at many levels, and not necessarily specific physical space, but culturally safe places. So it does become a physical place where people could gather together and where they could discuss different teaching approach, or that really is designed to structure support the student. What's very interesting as well is to look at all the process that UCAT has lately developed to develop its own territorial acknowledgement and action plan. So the large scale reflection that has been done on this territorial acknowledgement and action plan. So if you go and look at our site at UCAT, you'll see all the programs that are in Indigenous context. There's a large diversity of program that is promoted, of course. Language and indigenization content, learning together is really emphasis. And it's also based on the principle that these are collective learning. Yes, university makes place to the Indigenous knowledge, which allows the Indigenous people to have access to teaching, superior education, higher education. University is really, really benefiting a lot from this approach. Of course, it takes some kind of a commitment. So through different projects that have been implemented, the different engine research projects that are really now at the UQAM, they're putting in place different policy, all the reflection that they had on the structure of the university. Well, it still shows a commitment that is really real. Actually, it's really go above the words. It really had some action done. And then the institution, ERRSA-Qc-NEIHR Research Network, it was organized in 2021 by Alexandre Balcon. I joined the team last November, in November 2022. Institute ERRSA-Qc-NEIHR is based on 3 acts. The first one is education, of course. So we have different module of training regarding to different issues. We have online conferences. We have online teaching. We have conferences. The second act is the component that I'm taking care of, which is we make research with partners. We do also research for ourselves, making documentation, prepare new documents, And also, we also do strategic accompaniment with different organizations and businesses for different subjects, for instance, to develop different approaches more appropriate to develop or recruit staff of First Nations people and different organizations. So when I started to get interested in this component, we had we realized many situations within the team, like we mentioned about the delay and of serious research in the Indigenous field. The inter and university competition is really strong. Since there's very little students right now at the university level, we're really pulling each other's the students, because it brings a huge in commitment in administration and management. And so we work more towards a sharing of information and knowledge. So we're trying to do it inter-university rather. And we also wanted to promote the career in research, but at all levels, not only at the level of superior studies. Indigenous community have a lot of need in research field, not only in research that will affect second and third cycle in university. It could be in photography, it could be in classification of archives, it could be many levels where research is needed. Or interest in the First People student that would allow us to train researcher at all level and eventually at the higher cycle, superior cycle of studies. So in order to do this, we're sort of targeting and focusing our effort in making with partnership with different other universities in order to combine research experiences, specifically the first level experiences in the Indigenous field, that should be pleasant, safe, and interesting and appropriate. We have internship groups that are organized with a different level of university, and these internship are really trained in Indigenous context. They're really informed about the research, the issues with the Indigenous people, and we make sure that the communication with different Indigenous partner would be absolutely efficient. And we also have different projects. We're trying to develop a project, a doctorate level with a research center at Ashukam. We have different model, which is important actually. We want that the research would be more collaborative, multidisciplinary, and that research would be really present at all levels. And the research and community should be adapted to the communities, specific communities that is studied, and which in a few years from now, we could probably reduce and the differences that there are in the level of research between Francophone and Anglophone researcher. So if you have any interest or interest in trying to develop or join some of our research project, so I suggest you remain in contact with us, keep in touch with us. I have posted here all my information where you can reach me at any time. So please, I'm inviting you. Let's keep contact.
Okay, thank you so much, Edith, for your presentation. So we will turn it over to Tara to talk to us about the work that the BC-NEIHR is doing.
Thanks, everyone. So everyone can see my screen fine?
So we see your presenter view.
Oh, how do I change that?
It might be in your display settings at the top.
Sorry. No, it's not letting me present any of that. It's okay, I can just do it without presenter view.
Tara, on that screen. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I just don't know how to see my notes from here though. But I probably don't need my notes. It's all good. Thank you everybody for having me join your webinar, and thank you, Amelia, for welcoming. I'd like to acknowledge I'm calling in from the Lekwungen speaking territory of the WSÁNEĆ, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples, on whose territory the university stands, as well as our BC offices. I also raised my family here and study here, so very grateful to be on these territories. I'm going to present a little bit of work on Indigenous cultural safety in the context of research. This is really about creating a supportive environment for Indigenous-led health research, and really part of broader anti-Indigenous racism initiatives that the BC NEIHR is taking in the context of research. I include this quote from Elder Albert Marshall: "Seeds germinate when the environment is right." CHR also has a note about this on their website, like taking a really environmental structural approach to things. So we've created a framework, an ICS, Indigenous Cultural Safety Framework, that's available on our website. And in that goes into this more with this like tree metaphor, understanding how while we have ethics and ethical processes, it really works within a broader environment. Roots of epistemology and ontology, and in the systems where in STEM environments where resources kind of are controlled and flowed. And while we focus on ethics, we really have to keep this kind of broader, bigger perspective of how things work together and how they're supporting certain things and not supporting other things. We in this tree kind of metaphor look at what we call core research structures as like the trunk of the tree. And included in that is the REBs, so research ethic boards, particularly institutional ones. We know a crucial component of research is to ensure safe, collaborative, and productive research, we need competent ethics reviewers, which include community members as well as faculty and institutional members. In BC, there are a number of strategies and initiatives happening. So with our strong partnerships, we're partnered with all of the health authorities, all of the support units. We're partnered with SPORE, Health Research BC, and with all the REBs in BC. There's 27 of them. We see this real kind of like chance to create change at the institutional level by this partnership and combining our initiatives and strategic plans. So a project we started in 2021 was working with all of the REBs in BC and the leadership from Research Ethics BC. We had two considerations, Indigenous specific questions in the ethics application. We have a harmonized process as well as single jurisdiction. So harmonized is if you're working with many institutions, you can just do the one form. And if you single jurisdiction, like UVic, University of Victoria still has its own ethics application. So we looked at both, looking at the content of the applications themselves and the process of applying for ethics. And then the other key consideration was transformative learning and education. So what tools and resources could be built. And to target the core structure of ethics in BC, we conducted an environmental scan. 21 of the 27 REBs participated in this environmental scan, where we talked to multiple members of the board from each of those 21 REBs. So there was probably like 75 members we spoke to, just about their understanding, challenges, strengths, and we created a huge report out of that. We also conducted 3 sharing circles at 3 different universities, speaking to research Indigenous researchers, faculty, as well as graduate students and community members about the process of going through ethics, as well as that content scan of looking at all of the applications in BC. And the method, I kind of just already went over this, who we spoke to. We did have a few Indigenous students that helped us like conduct the knowledge gathering. The main topics that came out of the discussion, for particularly this was with speaking with the REB members, was restricted powers. So many of them recognized and were quite honest and transparent about the barriers and aware of them for Indigenous researchers and community members. A lot of times they're working in this, and again, thinking this structural environmental approach, they're working within an institution where there's a lot of pushback. So there was a lot of, while they want to make meaningful changes, they weren't up against the university or many faculty members that resisted. There wasn't much power within the REBs to make the changes. And a lot of what happens in the REBs, it's voluntary. Like the REB members themselves are voluntary, like they get course buyout time. But, you know, as for example, training, they can't force REB members to take certain training, although many of them pretty much did through strongly encouraging it, like taking OCAP. For example, a few REBs made their members take OCAP training through the governance center and found that it really increased confidence and capacity within their REB. Good segue to capacity and resources. REBs are shockingly under-resourced. We found that out, and a big help was when they had access to be able to network with other REBs and that they could share resources, as well as when they had Indigenous representation on the board. It really increased their confidence and capacity to implement Chapter 9 or navigate tensions when they did arise. But yeah, capacity is definitely an ongoing issue with almost every single REB that we spoke with. That goes into education and training. Again, they can't mandate most education and training, and they did recognize a need. Actually, what came out of this was that Research Ethics BC was going to find funding to be able to make available the OCAP training for all REB members, paid for, because that was so apparent, just the lack of access to certain education and training. And then there were certain key ethical issues that came out for institutions and particularly non-Indigenous researchers. Again, a lot of that comes back to just like needing this bigger paradigm shift that has to happen at an institutional level for there to be really meaningful changes within the REB process, like ethical process. There was many wise practices that came out of this, like there was pages and pages, and the leadership of Research Ethics BC was quite surprised to hear of some of the amazing work that even some of the smaller REBs were doing. Like, for example, one was an incredibly strong partnership with the local, we say ICCO, Indigenous Community Collective and Organization, was in strong partnership with the local ICCO, and there was definitely attempts to support ICCO-based and advanced ICCO ethics processes and protocols, so having their own, and the ways that institutional REBs can be supportive of that. We did see definitely many attempts to support Indigenous researchers in general and be flexible. There was clear mindfulness of not wanting to overburden Indigenous board members. So, you know, giving them all the Indigenous applications to the one reviewer, like, and understanding that the board itself needs to make changes to be able to review competently Indigenous research ethics applications. There was desire for change, and like I said, many, many examples of wise practices. The document itself I'm speaking of is not public because it was just knowledge gathering to inform our next research steps and inform which we are getting ethics for and applying for a grant, and then that will be made public. So I'm just kind of giving a brief overview. And then the ethics circles, again, that was with Indigenous researchers and community members who have gone through the ethics process. And the positive feedback that came out was an increasingly that REBs were kind of embracing the complexity of Indigenous research and really trying to be flexible and supportive of Indigenous leadership. So rather than them having the authority and taking, you know, the control of the research and the ethics process, like leaving that up to the finding ways to support the Indigenous researcher community to have that leadership. And they are trying to focus on approachability. This is a key issue. There is clearly a lack of any sort of relationship between ICCOs and REBs. And for good reason, there's, you know, and understandable reasons. I mean, long history of harm in research and just harm in general from colonization. And so REBs are really trying to be approachable, like we're people, come talk to us if you have questions or you want to work something out, you want to talk about the research. But there's still actually clear fear and hesitancy among Indigenous researchers and community members to not go to the REBs. So that is something we're really looking at, of how can we find some convening space here, because these relations need to happen to make research safer and make research better. That's part of the gaps and challenges, that ongoing fear and hesitancy, concerns about accountability. You know, REBs are still kind of tied to the Tri-Council policy and the institution. So it's about protecting the institution while they are recognizing it's supposed to be about protecting those that are involved in research. There's still clear experiences of harm. So we heard many, many examples, and very, very discriminatory practices still. Community-based and ICCO-based ethics. So that's a big topic in the literature as well. The BC NEIHR on our website, we actually have an interactive map of BC that we have identified 17 ICCO-based ethics in BC, and you can just click on the icon, like we've pinned it on the BC map, and that's where community has their own ethics process, like framework. It's available, it's public, and you know, people have to go through both if they want to work with that community. But REBs are really like trying to recognize the you know, the authority of the ICCO based ones, but there's so much tension that comes with that. So that came out a lot. And then just general Indigenous cultural safety and ethical behavior. So our future pathways was about protecting Indigenous knowledges, for example, in all of the ethics applications that we looked at. I think only 7, and we looked at many applications, had a question involving protecting Indigenous knowledge. They also really didn't have any questions about Indigenous leadership. It was more, are Indigenous people involved, which is very different, or partnered, which is very different than leadership. So that's a future pathway, increasing accountability, and again, the approachability of REBs, finding that kind of like relational convening spaces that we can create. And then more resources and resourcing. We really want to focus on building the competency of REBs. So how interpreting and implementing Chapter 9, increasing collaboration between these groups, those convening spaces, and increase ICCO engagement in the ethics and ethical processes. That actually might also look like a funding call. We're looking at creating a funding call for ICCOs to develop their own ethic framework in research. I love to see that map we have of BC that just have pins all over BC instead of the 17, because we have almost 300 ICCOs in BC. We're a very diverse province. And lastly, I'll just end on, based on all of that information that came out of that environmental scan, which I think the report was like 150 pages, the full report. We have applied for a CHR project grant. It has been submitted. The NPI is Krista Stalkaya out of SFU, Simon Fraser University here in BC. We have a really diverse team. There's 29 people named on the grant, including 2 elders. We have representation from First Nations Health Authority, Métis Nation BC, the Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers, Health Research BC, 5 universities, and the Office of the Provincial Health Officer. And we're basically going to be taking what we learned and the priorities and gaps that we came out of all that knowledge gathering and be researching that over the next 3 years, including creating that convening space, exploring more of the perspectives, and documenting all the wise practices that we came across and create like an available resource for REBs as well as Indigenous researchers. We find out in October if we are successful, and it would start January 2024. And so overall, all this work is we're hoping to collaboratively create a model of Indigenous cultural safety and research, that build the capacity of those Western core research structures. So again, the trunk of the tree, to support Indigenous-led research and anti-Indigenous racism as a pillar of research ethics. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you everyone for having me again. I have about 5 minutes before I have to go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Tara. And I'll just ask my other colleagues with the Qc-NEIHR if there's a certain process for how we would like to do any questions, or if we're out of time.
For those who can remain, we can, take 10 minutes or so. But if you need to leave, that's understandable. Yeah, so go ahead, Colin, you can.
Excellent. So if anyone has any questions, you can either unmute or ask your question in the chat. And just a reminder, you can feel free to ask your question in English or French, as we have simultaneous translation.
Hi, I can try with a question. I'm gonna try to speak in English too. I'm a PhD student at UQAT, also like Edith, and I'm the coordinator of the Dialect Network here in Quebec. My question would be like, I don't know, how do we go from community-based Indigenous research, where we have tools to receive the research from the universities, to really a community-led research where the communities decide what is the research and have the tool to do the research, like partly by themselves and with the help of the researcher. I don't know if that's clear, but anyone can answer.
So I'll just open it up to my fellow panelists to see if anyone has anything they would like to respond with.
I'll respond based on what I was presenting, Emmanuel, in Kahnawake. Like what we saw that was the environment that nurtured that partnership was, the leadership within the project, I think is an important role. But, we also have this, our values that we have the decision making, we have the right to make decisions about our lives in general, and that permeates through all aspects of governance in the community. So having that strong belief and practice and applying it to research was an important part. But in terms of having the, I think about that question a lot as well, because people ask, how we do that, or if they can adapt the code. And it's like, yes, it's there for you to use whatever you find useful out of it. But it does take a lot of, it takes resources as well. It takes people who are dedicated to following that way of working, sharing that way of working, having people willing to work that way. So it also involves a lot of capacity building. And so I think that's an important part that, like, we're seeing in communities, there's a great interest to make decisions about research, but often there's not the resources to do so, or they're looking for, well, how do we do that? What are we getting into when we do that? So I think we have some good examples out there. And as the nominated principal applicant for the NEIHR in Quebec, that was my vision, like based on what we did at KSDPP and how others had found it useful. How can we support the environment to nurture best practices? Because KSDPP's model is one way, and there are other ways that have been shared. I think if you go to the commission, the First Nations of Quebec and Labrador Health and Social Services Commission, they have many tools there. But then we need the environment, the capacity, the resources, and the recognition to be able to do that. Because there's a lot involved with research. And the last thing I've been thinking about too is just data, OCAP principles, ownership of and stewardship and possession of data is also very it requires resources and ways that, communities can do that. So I think that's not the answer to your question, but I think that's a big part of where we need to enhance the capacity.
Thank you.
Sarah? You're muted.
Yeah, thanks, Trina. Yeah, and I was just thinking, like in the BC NEIHR experience, recognizing the varying capacities among ICCOs and where people are, where they're at. Because, the New Chalmette here, for example, they just working with Dr. Jeff Redding, I think they just got like a $14 million grant. So their research capacity is at a very different level compared to some ICCOs we're working with that they don't have access to Adobe. Right. So, and it's really about meeting people, the resources that are needed where they're at as well, and then developing the capacities of where they're at is a huge step, because some ICCOs, they haven't even been given resources and time to figure out priority setting. So that really needs to be developed first, and meaningful and trusting relationships. I'll just add quickly, we have health research facilitators. We've had them for 3 years, working very, very closely with the communities in that capacity bridging component. And for some of them, it's taken at least a year to develop a meaningful, trusting relationship where just now, they're ready to even apply for their own funding through us. Right. So, recognizing the varying capacities, and then also knowing that some might be starting at just even finding out what their priorities are. Right?
Okay, thank you very much, Tara. Any other questions for our speakers? Okay, great. So I just seen the message in the chat from Audrey. So we're unfortunately out of time for today, but if you do have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us, and we can respond to those questions by email as well, specifically.